Please welcome Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security.
Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Brent Sadler. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. And we are joined by an illustrious and I think someone of significant importance from American Samoa, Congresswoman Rattawagin. And I'll give a little bit more background on her later, but I want to start with a thank you to perhaps one of the most important figures here at Heritage Foundation that has been able to bring a very wide group of folks, experts from going back many decades with a deep investment and interest in the Pacific Islands. Andrew Harding, and his most recent paper, The Pacific Pivot, which has some very remarkable ideas that are catching traction, again, from both sides of the political spectrum, both the House, the Senate, and across with many allies in the Pacific. If you have not seen it, I encourage you to pick it up and read it. It will be the rage as we go forward in the next couple of years with the ideas, and again, from a luminary like Andrew Harding that has taken an interest in this very important region. A region that I, quite frankly, call home. I have family in the islands, so it's also deeply personal to me to hear and listen and learn from Congresswoman Amuamata Coleman Rattawagin and her ideas as she provides comments here in a very short while. But again, thank you for coming today. This will be followed, the Congresswoman's comments will be followed with a panel where we'll dive in even more deeply. But now just a little bit more about Congresswoman Rattawagin that I think is important. Some commonality, I lived in Guam and have family that are still there. She's a graduate of the University of Guam, so very proud to hear that and commonality. She's also the first Republican and the first woman Congresswoman from American Samoa. And I think that, you know, leader in the first is something to call out. It comes with a lot of pressure, but she has a lot to say. And I will leave it at this point. Congresswoman, would you please come to the stage? We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Brent. I'm delighted to be here today. Talofa, talofa lava. It's good to be here with all of you, and thank you for all that the Heritage Foundation does in research, analysis, and bringing together ideas to strengthen the country and promote peace and freedom. This is a gathering of friends to the Pacific Island peoples, and with a new administration and Congress coming into office next month, I appreciate the chance to share some thoughts about the current events in the Pacific and where the U.S. might chart the course in the years ahead. I've been working on my remarks since I was invited to make them some weeks ago, but I scrapped my approach in light of recent events in South America, where Peru hosted this year's APEC summit. So instead of presenting an update on our regional agenda and commenting extensively on Andrew's excellent paper, this is it. I want to start with talking about the perceptions and realities created by news coverage of President Biden's audience with the People's Republic of China, President Xi Jinping in Lima, Peru, and coverage of the president's time there in general. Our House Select Committee on China refers to PRC as Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, rather than CPP, because we have no quarrel with the people, just the Communist Party that rules them. So I employ the Select Committee's terminology in speaking of the CCP. It was disconcerting. The worldwide headlines gave a sense of CCP domination of the 2024 APEC proceeding against a backdrop of the Pacific coast of the South American continent. And it didn't help that President Biden was treated as second fiddle, and the media made it appear that he spent a lot of time wandering around aimlessly. He may be leaving office soon, but he is our president and the leader of the most powerful country on earth, and I don't like the treatment he received from other leaders and by the press. In Lima, President Xi took center stage before the world in recognition that the CCP has replaced the United States as a continent's largest trading partner. But even that story of the CCP's trade boom was eclipsed by Xi's unveiling of his new $3.5 billion megaport at Chanque, Peru. This creates the prospect of establishing effectively a new bridge across the Pacific, moving a great volume of exports and imports between China and South America. The Chanque port has the potential to host CCP naval and military forward positioning, spreading influence into the Americas. While CCP was expanding into South America, the U.S. has wisely prioritized first and second island chain counterpositioning. That included our buildup at Guam and Palau, as well as Space Force downlinks and Army missile programs at Kwajalein, enabled under the 2024 COFA renewal treaties. The Heritage Foundation's Pacific Pivot Report confirms that America and our friends in the Pacific have focused bilateral and multilateral priorities on the historically Micronesian and Melanesian nations further to the west and north of the PIF region. That focus evokes in Washington the metaphor of a bridge across the Pacific from the American West Coast to Hawaii. This American bridge to the Pacific was extended to Guam and CNMI north of the equator, then the freely associated states, the Pacific Islands Forum or PIF region, and beyond to Asia. Meanwhile, from my perspective in American Samoa, the only U.S. homeland jurisdiction in the South Pacific, the new bridge across the Pacific between PRC and Peru changes, for better or worse, the potential for expanded PRC presence and influence in the South Pacific. American Samoa is located at the center of the huge Polynesian triangle that lies to the east and south of the Melanesian and Micronesian subregions of the Pacific, which understandably have been the focus of more U.S. counterpositioning. Island leaders in the South Pacific now face a new metaphor and new realities of a bridge of PRC running through our islands, waters, and airspace across the Pacific Island chain homelands of our peoples to South America. The shipping lanes from China mainland to all the major ports must pass through the Polynesian Triangle, at the center of which is the smaller triangle of the Tongan and Samoan Islands and eastern Fiji, all of which share common cultural values and family ties. In the aftermath of the 2024 APEC meeting, it's clear the islands I represent in Congress, along with our more southerly and westerly U.S.-aligned PIF partner nations, find ourselves in the pathway, perhaps at the crossroads of the PRC route through the South Pacific, with obvious flyover and stopover possibilities on their new superhighway to South America. It also is a reality that CCP state enterprises can have a subversive comparative advantage in competition with democracies in terms of CCP unlawful political and economic warfare, which we know they exercise as if that is their rightful prerogative. Thus, the Americas are the Western Hemisphere from a historically Eurocentric perspective, which culminated in the events during the 20th century that made it also the century of the Atlantic. Politicians and diplomats long have talked of the 19th century being the century of the Mediterranean, the 20th century being the century of the Atlantic, and the 21st century being the century of the Pacific. The Americas served as the Western Front for 2 European wars in the 20th century, and now current events truly have made the Americas the Eastern Front for whatever challenges that lie ahead in the 21st century. Finally, making this the century of the Pacific, with our islands situated right in the middle. In that context, my message is that America, its allies and partners throughout the Blue Continent, and the larger Indo-Pacific need to decide if we have the will to remain free and democratic. Can we harness the energies and capabilities of our peoples to face and overcome threats to international peace and security? Which of our friends around the world will stand with us to restore the rule of law and liberty that is being eroded? The 2022 Pacific Islands Summit Declaration was worthwhile but limited as a regional agenda. Can we do more than its call to leverage partnerships and enhancing relationships? The crucial multilateralism of the India, Australia, Japan, US Quad, and the Australia, France, New Zealand, US Quadrilateral Defense Coordinating Group is imperative. But the hope for success of these security partnerships encourages us to more bold thinking about the lessons of history. As we aspire to a Pacific pivot that is more than a slogan, we recall that the century of the Atlantic also was defined by what was then an Atlantic pivot, choreographed by leaders of the great Atlantic powers. I refer, of course, to the Atlantic Charter, signed aboard the USS Augusta in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, in August 1941. It was a declaration against territorial aggrandizement through illegal aggression and committed the Allies to self-determination for all peoples based on the American idea of government by consent of the governed. The Atlantic Charter defined freedom under law for the nations of the world. Just in time, because 4 months later, the great battle of the Atlantic century spread to the Pacific and erupted in America's backyard at Pearl Harbor. And that was the first day in more than 1,000 days of war for the U.S., ending in a great victory that was never guaranteed, an epic struggle to liberate our islands in which the U.S. became a true Pacific power, fighting in 2 oceans on Asian as well as European fronts, America's defense of freedom around the world to preserve freedom at home became an American creed. Joined by resistance fighters from our island peoples, Americans from distant farms of the Midwest, and crowded inner cities of the East became island warriors of the Pacific. Self-determination principles of the 1941 Atlantic Charter became the founding principles of the United Nations Charter in 1945. That included the trusteeship provisions under which the United States administered the islands now known as the Republic of Palau, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. In 1984, messages to Congress by President Reagan and his administration asked for ratification of the Compact of Free Association, or COFA, as an unprecedented instrument of U.S. foreign relations and referred to the self-determination principles of the Atlantic Charter and Trustee Agreement, which are still part of the 3 COFA agreements. Harkening back to that noble past now beckons us to a different, hopefully peaceful, but equally determined and noble endeavor to secure a future of freedom under law. Instead of a Pacific pivot affirming the post-World War II values that prevailed in the last Cold War, are the U.S. and its Pacific partners equal to the CCP challenge in the second quarter of the 21st century. Some call it a new Cold War, with a notable exception being U.S. trade volume with China. Can a united Indo-Pacific community composed of freedom-loving peoples in free enterprise nations with democratic models of self-government now summon the resolve equal to the competitive challenge we face from CCP? I speak of moral, legal, political, strategic, and economic resolve. And to do so, we must overcome the unlawful, weaponized political warfare that the CCP utilizes, which prevents it from joining the ranks of the mainstream nations seeking comity and reciprocity in the international commons. To facilitate consideration of such a new era, I am calling for a Pacific Charter for Indo-Pacific freedom to emulate the Atlantic Charter of 83 years ago, and have provided a conceptual draft that I encourage the Heritage Foundation to consider as it further develops its proposals for the U.S. in the Pacific. I also am leaving with you additional proposals I will be working on in the House in the next Congress that outline related initiatives on Pacific Islands regional health care, Marshall Island nuclear test claims, U.S. fishery policy in Pacific, and real political status democratization options for U.S. unincorporated island territories. I look forward to comments and suggestions from Heritage Foundation and other organizations involved with the Pacific and with leadership of our Indo-Pacific community of nations to advance a new multilateral agenda. What I want to leave with you today is an image to consider. It is a vision of President Trump, together with heads of government from Pacific Island nations and our Indo-Pacific friends and allies aboard a U.S. vessel in Pago Pago Harbor in the center of the Blue Continent, emulating the 1941 signing of the Atlantic Charter, the declaration of a new Pacific Charter for this Pacific century and beyond. Not only is Pago Pago Harbor at the center of the Blue Continent, but it is also considered by many to be the finest harbor in the Pacific, which is why the U.S. negotiated with our high chiefs almost 125 years ago to have exclusive access to the islands of which it is a part. We'll be celebrating the special anniversary of our association with the U.S. next April. My dear friend, Fiame Mataafa, the Prime Minister of neighboring independent Samoa, with which we share the Samoan Islands, recently successfully hosted the 2024 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, over which King Charles III presided. We were a little bit jealous of her hosting the king, but nevertheless, I would enthusiastically welcome her to come over to Pago Pago to join President Trump and other heads of government in signing our proposed Pacific Charter. I would love nothing better to do than to do so at the time of our 125th anniversary of being American, as well as Samoan. But I know time is too short to reach agreement. But we would start now so that we have an agreed upon document before President Trump leaves office. I will close by telling those of you who do not know that the name of my island home means a sacred place of heavenly peace. Samoans will explain to you that we believe the Samoan Islands are the Garden of Eden for the Polynesian people, and that God put us there, which explains why we are the only Polynesian island group that has no folklore about canoes bringing their first inhabitants from somewhere else. And of course, Pacific Ocean means peaceful ocean. So with the Pacific Charter, I hope it will bring us the peace that we pray for the Indo-Pacific and all the world. Thank you. Soy fua maia manuia.
Thank you. We'll now have the panel join us on the stage. And again, thank you again to Congresswoman Radewagen and your time.
I'm sorry.
A big thanks to Representative Radewagen for her robust remarks and for her call for a Pacific Charter. We'll be poring over her speech for some time. When I go home to visit my hometown in rural Pennsylvania, I'll see old friends from high school sometimes, and they'll say, you know, don't you work down in DC at a think tank? What is a think tank? I'm not even sure I know what they do. And I say, I'm not really sure either. Are you just some kind of like overpaid political prognosticator? Yeah, at our worst, that probably is correct. But at our best, I think think tankers can be catalysts for change and incubators of important ideas. And it has been extremely encouraging to see my colleague, Andrew Harding, so early in his career, frankly, fresh out of undergrad, come to Heritage, and a little over a year ago, take up the portfolio of the Pacific Islands because he believed this was both a critically important region of the world, but also a region that had been underserved in US policy and the US consciousness. And so he began serving as a convener of interested parties in the Pacific Islands from Capitol Hill, from the executive branch, from the private sector, from other think tanks, and ended up really playing a significant role in both moving the debate forward, but also getting practical action done, and specifically in getting the COFA agreements passed last year, building support for that within Heritage and within the broader policy community, getting these important agreements signed, and more recently publishing really a landmark strategy for the Pacific Islands. And to see how in demand he has been, his ideas have been, he's been in to brief numerous members of Congress. The Biden administration has wanted to talk to him to get his ideas on the Pacific Island. He's sparked a lot of conversation here at Heritage, has just been so rewarding, frankly. And Andrew, you've done an incredible job, so we're really in many ways here to celebrate you today, but really also to talk about your paper. So let's get started with that. You published on October 1st, The Pacific Pivot, an American Strategy for the Pacific Islands, Heritage's first ever publication outlining a national strategy for U.S. engagement in the region. What motivated you to produce this strategy document, and how did it all come together?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jeff, for that very kind opening. A lot of that starts with having a good team and a good boss that allows these opportunities to be possible. So I would not be here in this position and working on these things without your support and the team support here at Heritage. So a big credit to you and many of the people in the room to make this possible that have helped in being these initiatives. Greg's here, Cleo, and everyone else involved. It's a team effort. It's an honor to do this type of work. And as Jeff mentioned, to take a crack at trying to make change here in a think tank environment. For the Pacific Pivot paper, in a way, I wish I heard Congresswoman Radewagen's speech 7 months earlier, because I found it to be very inspiring about the type of thinking that I think this town and this country needs when it comes to thinking about long-term, everlasting change in the Pacific. When we think about making sure the United States is there for the long haul and delivers on its actions and is thinking boldly. That's the type of thinking that certainly went into the Pacific Pivot. And So certainly 7 months ago, what really motivated me were two things. First was thinking about how to build momentum off of the success of the compact renewals. It took a little longer than I think many of us would have preferred to get things over the line. But when it did, one of my initial reactions was, how do we keep Washington's focus on the region? I didn't want us to fall into a narrative trap of dusting our hands and thinking that, well, we'll come back in 20 years and we have to renew this thing again. And oh, by the way, what's a COFA? I wanted to make sure that we thought about, okay, in the next 20 years and beyond, what are some things we can be doing? What are some practical things? How should we be thinking about the region? And wanting to produce a document that really tries to keep that engagement going from the long haul, to really build off this momentum about getting the compacts over the line and keeping it and expanding on that. The second motivator was wanting to fill a policy gap to where I think the Trump administration, the first one, and led kudos to Alex Gray and his team and those he worked with, as well as the Biden administration, to their credit for some of the initiatives they've been working on. There's been a lot of progress we've seen in the region from an American perspective. And something I wanted to make clear in this report was, as all this money, attention, resources, and focus is focused on this renewed engagement in the Pacific, I wanted to produce something that outlines what America's strategy ought to be, at least elements of it, helping understand what should America be pursuing, what are the means of engagement to get to these ends, what does cooperation look like, how do we understand competition, cooperation, how do we work to help resolve the needs that the Pacific has, how do we consider what the American people are concerned about, and making sure that policymakers and the American people have a good understanding as to why focusing on the Pacific Islands is very much an American interest. So those are certainly some of the motivators that help lead to the Pacific Pivot.
Okay, let's dig a little further before circling around. In the report, you argue the single most important factor that drives this renewed interest in U.S. engagement with the Pacific Islands is their pivotal location, which is important to U.S. efforts to deny China's regional hegemonic ambitions that directly threaten American security, prosperity, and freedom. What is ultimately at stake in the Pacific Islands for the American people?
Sure. I think Congressman Radewagen laid this out a bit as well, to where should China's ambitions be reached, whether that's regarding to gaining access, moving its military towards the region, forward positioning resources, influencing airspace, et cetera, it ultimately does threaten the prosperity and economic security of the American people. One of the first things that this report looks at, and it includes a graphic right away from the National World War II Museum, of looking at the U.S. Pacific strategy in 1943. And it shows how at the time Imperial Japan physically occupied a bunch of territory in the Pacific at this time. And it's something that many Americans will remember during, say, world history in high school. It's something you'll remember about the island hopping strategy and the necessity to push back on what Japan had gained at this time. And certainly Japan was establishing, say, a sphere of influence, the ability to deny access to the region, secure resources, supply chains, physically occupy territory. It's something that the American people can remember from years past, whatever profession you're in. But now if you think 80 years to today from that time, I think you could fill in that China's ambitions are pretty similar, although the tactics are very different. I think we've seen, certainly, say, the Solomon Islands Agreement, the Security Pact, and the ability to have Chinese police come on in, and the details involved with that agreement. We've seen infringements on sovereignty towards Palau, exclusive economic zone, the weaponization of tourism and economic programs, the cyber hacking of countries and regional institutions. It's no surprise that China is following a similar playbook for that geography, to slowly poke and prod and crack down on America's defense architecture that it's worked to build with its allies and partners, as well as its Pacific friends. So what does that then mean for if an American is to ask, so what? If China can succeed on those ambitions, if it ultimately can, which as this paper contends, and it does a deeper dive into Chinese thinking and its ambitions to gain access to this geography, it could ultimately make it harder to keep the American people safe. Should there be a crisis or conflict in the Indo-Pacific, say it's Taiwan, South China Sea, or maybe our allies are involved with the Philippines, Japan, et cetera, there are more than 200,000 American citizens in the region. Guam, CNMI, American Samoa, other places, to where if America's access through the Pacific, a geographical basis, is hindered, that makes it more difficult to keep the American people safe, to win in a conflict, and to uphold our treaty obligations to our allies and partners, and to keep the Pacific a peaceful region. But secondly, and as Congresswoman Radewagen, I think really had a good perspective on, is trade from a more of an economic angle, to where, let's say we look at South America and Chinese trade continues to expand throughout. We see more of a pivot down towards trade expanding there. It's in China's interest to protect that. So should China have the ability to infringe on supply routes? And A, they need to have a military presence to protect their routes, but B, should there be a time of crisis, China can infringe on current supply routes and trade venues and distribution that's flowing through the Pacific. So for an everyday American, that means you could see a difference on what's on the shelves in your stores, should the Chinese decide to take advantage of disrupting supply chains. So I think from that perspective, from a security angle, from an economic prosperity angle, what we're seeing in the Pacific and how America acts, how its allies and partners act, certainly what China is doing in the region, very much puts things into perspective as to what's at stake for the American people.
Thank you. Greg, I want to turn to you next, but first I want to thank you, and I want to thank Cleo, because as capable as Andrew is, he probably would not have been able to do all of this good work without being able to lean on very experienced experts from the field who travel to the region, who have spent years, in some cases decades, working in the region with firsthand experience, and who have really worked with us in a very collaborative spirit the entire time. So thank you to both of you in particular. I've had the privilege of being able to sit in on some of the roundtable discussions, and just an incredible exchange of ideas and collaborative spirit among you. So Greg, I want to ask you, both Congresswoman Radewagen and Andrew's report emphasize the importance of alliance and partners. One of the United States' key advantages over China is our network of alliances and partners. Australia, New Zealand, and Japan are three important examples. How has the U.S. worked with these allies and partners to engage the region and counter Chinese advances, and how are we doing? Are things on the right track?
Well, thanks, first of all, Jeff, for having me here today and hosting this event, and congratulations, Andrew, on getting this report out. I know it was a monumental effort, took a long time to get it produced, but I find it both timely, constructive, and provocative, which is why it's important we're having this discussion here today. I think with regard to being on the right track, maybe I'll start with that and to say that yes, we're probably on the right track, but the train probably isn't moving fast enough. In particular with regard to allies and partners, they're also looking at the United States to say, now that the U.S. is back in the region more fully than before, after we've had the pivot that was going to happen in 2011, 2012, we had the whole last decade. Trump administration comes in, more emphasis, focus on China in particular. Biden administration doubles down on that in the Pacific. A couple of summits, very important to get that out there. A new strategic policy document that gets a U.S. approach in the Pacific, what the U.S. would like to do, mainly focused on the interests of the Pacific, but where do we go from here? Allies and partners are the key part of this for any administration moving forward here in the U.S. One, as we've already discussed, the region is so vast, it is so diverse. We tend to think of it as the Pacific, and we've talked about it here. And talked about the various peoples of the Pacific, the Micronesians, the Melanesians, the Polynesians, as if they are all the same, as if they have the same interests, as if we can approach them all equally in the same way. Well, we do approach them equally, but they have different interests, and our allies and partners in the broader region can help us do that. Of course, Japan is very interested and has been there a long time and has been a long-time partner and has a deep and rich tradition of its own in the Pacific. Very interested in the economy. It has a particular niche that it feels the U.S. doesn't fill. Everybody knows when Japan shows up to build an infrastructure project, they're getting quality. We should lean into that. Let the Japanese do some of that. The Australians and New Zealanders never left the Pacific. It's always been part of who they are. It's part of their identity. New Zealand in particular is a Pacifica nation. So their foreign policy is directly focused on the region to its north. The Australians likewise are the Western power that has consular and embassy officials in every single independent Pacific Island state. The U.S. isn't even close to that yet, so Australia is coming in a big way. We should lean into those partners. South Korea, of course, is a relatively new partner in the Pacific, but has made outreach to the region, bringing Pacific Islanders to South Korea and reaching out to figure out what sort of role it can play in political and economic development. I think what's lacking in terms of the alliances is some really deep coordination. And the core of that problem, of course, is not just in the region, and certainly not in those allies necessarily, but here in Washington. And do we have the coordination from the State Department, from the White House, from the National Security Council to put the U.S. package together? What is our real vision? How do we envision using each of those allies? One of the recommendations, of course, in Andrew's report is first our special envoy to the Pacific, to the islands themselves. So this is an ambassador at large level role to directly work with them, to coordinate with them. I think we go farther than that. I think we need a special envoy to the rest of the allies and the partners, the Japans, the South Koreas, the Australians, New Zealand's, to coordinate that more directly. And then, of course, actually here in town to work horizontally across the various administration agencies and departments to make sure this town is coordinated, because that, I think, is what's actually lacking.
Thank you. Cleo, turning to you and focusing still on the region, you have seen firsthand some of the challenges the region faces with a particular focus on Chinese malign activities. Are there some places that the U.S. should be more concerned and more active than others?
Yes, thank you. And I'd just like to pile on to the thank yous to Heritage, because this has been, on the Pacific Island file, the most bipartisan, rewarding experience I've had in Washington. Heritage has really gone out of its way to convene, especially around the COFAs, everybody who is interested in the region and to find solutions and to move things forward. So I'm very grateful to Heritage, and especially Andrew, who took this on along with everything else to move this forward. It's really made a practical difference. And I also have a map. I don't know whether that's actually going to appear, but a map tends to be helpful when you start talking about the Pacific Islands. Yay! All right. So we talked about the different regions in the Pacific. I would argue that there are at least 3 different policies that the U.S. should have in the Pacific. One is for Americans in the Pacific. I mean, there's a lot of America in the in the region. Everything that's dark blue here is United States of America. We heard about American Samoa, that's down there. That's on this, as Congresswoman Radowagen mentioned, this bridge or highway between China and Latin America that has its own whole set of issues. But there's also this bridge or corridor that's going east to west that was bought in the blood of Americans 80 years ago in battles like Truk or Peleliu, Saipan, Tinian. These are soaked in to the locations, and many of those locations also send a lot of people to serve in the U.S. military. These connections are very deep. So I would argue that first of all, you need something specifically for the Americans who live on Pacific Islands. You heard Congresswoman Radowagen. She's forgotten more than any of us will ever know about the Pacific Islands, and it's generational. Her father was incredibly instrumental in setting up of the structures of the region. There are incredible Pacific Islanders who are Americans who are experts in the region that need to be brought into the conversation and who are very, very concerned about what you're talking about, seeing a replication of the way that the Japanese co-prosperity sphere was starting to be established in the 30s is being replicated, the civil-military fusion with the Chinese approach. And looking just at CNMI, the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is above Guam, you mentioned the Japanese territories. So Japan, from 1914 to 1944, Japan, under the Japanese mandate of the League of Nations, controlled CNMI, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands as colonies. And that's what allowed Japan to project power to be able to hit Pearl Harbor and to make it very hard for the U.S. to get back across the Pacific. So this dark blue, that's the U.S., but then those lighter blues, those are the freely associated states. After so many Americans died in the region, this very unique relationship was enacted, where they're independent countries, but defense and security rights and responsibilities are with the U.S. Very complicated relationship. People of the FAS, the freely associated states, can live and work in the U.S. They serve in the U.S. military. They use the U.S. postal system. If anybody asks you which 3 independent countries are the closest allies of the U.S., it's Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. There's nothing else like it in the rest of the world. So that requires its own different set of policies. State Department under the new compact was required to set up a dedicated desk with 4 people on it. As far as I know, they still haven't done it. So these are relationships that multiple Congresses have identified as being fundamental. If you want a Pacific Charter, I would argue, we both know the Indians. I would think they would probably want to call it the Indo-Pacific Charter. Then you need to make sure that this area stays free of malign influence. I'm going to give you one concrete example of how this Chinese malign influence is operating in the United States, in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. Right now, Chinese can arrive in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, in Saipan, where so many Americans died, without a visa. They can just get off the plane and walk right into Saipan. Or Tinian, where a $400 million expansion is happening of the North Field, which was the most active airfield at the end of World War II. That's where the B-29s were taking off from to hit Japan, and that's where the Enola Gay took off from. That is being resurrected again by the Air Force, and Chinese can just get off the plane in Saipan, go over to Tinian. They're not supposed to leave the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, but by the hundreds, they're illegally taking boats to Guam, where they're disappearing, and some are being found wandering around the military bases. Currently, there's a push in CNMI by people who have Chinese business interests to get the US to drop the cap on direct flights from mainland China into CNMI. They're using this sort of transition period and lack of understanding about the region to push for direct flights from mainland China into the United States, into CNMI, where they can arrive without a visa and where they are disappearing into Guam. They've been convicted of, the woman that ran the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in CNMI was convicted of selling US driver's licenses to Chinese. They're using the US Postal Service to deliver drugs. The penetration is highly intense. The governor of CNMI has testified before Congress requesting a resident DA, investigations by Treasury, investigations by FBI to try to clean up his own system, but it's not coming. As a result, the infiltration is increasing and spreading and making it increasingly difficult to fight back. This is US territory. These are Americans. So you can only imagine what the situation is like in places like the Federated States of Micronesia. You described Solomon Islands. So I think that, first of all, you do these different focuses. First, you look at the American stuff. You've got all the tools you need to do that. Then you look at the FAS, and you can do things like use reservists or use, the Attorney General of Palau has been begging for lawyers to come and help her fight Chinese corruption in Palau. Right? We can send the aircraft carriers or the Mercy or whatever you want, but unless you start to rip that Chinese corruption out of the system, you're not going to be able to deploy. You can set up that airfield in Tinian, but right on the harbor of Tinian, right now, there's a Chinese casino. It's watching everything that's coming and going. Chinese-linked casino, I have to be careful. So I'd say first, take care of the Americans, and then build out to the FAS, which are like family, as Reagan said, and a separate policy for the rest of it, anchored off some of the things that Congresswoman Radewagen said on the American Samoa front.
I like what you said at the beginning of your answer, which is that this is a good example that bipartisanship isn't completely dead. It's on life support. You've got to go 7,000 miles away to find it on a speck in the middle of the Pacific, but it does exist. And it's also a testament to how obviously it is in U.S. national interest to maintain a presence and good relations with our Pacific Island partners that we were able to get COFAs across the finish line last year. Cleo, you mentioned the Solomon Islands in your remarks. We had an event about a year ago where we hosted Daniel Sweetani here, where he was quite candid in speaking about evidence of Chinese corruption in the Solomon Islands. Can you talk a little bit about what's been happening there with China and the gains it has been making in the Solomons and nearby?
The Solomon Islands, so this is the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, Bloody Ridge. A lot of Americans died there. When the end of history happened, The U.S. closed the embassy in the early 90s. And it was a country that switched from Taiwan to China in 2019. And among the allies, actually, Taiwan, there are 3 countries in the Pacific that still recognize Taiwan, and it would be very nice to see much more activity. The president is currently visiting them. He came off of Hawaii and Guam, and he's going to those 3 Pacific Island countries. So that having recognizing Taiwan means you don't have a Chinese embassy, and the Chinese embassies function like forward operating locations for influence operations. So recognizing Taiwan is actually a very helpful defense against the sort of thing that we saw happen in Solomons. So Solomons is, if you want to see what the Chinese playbook is, you start with 2019 in Solomon Islands and you see what they've done since then, who they went after. Customs, immigration, subnational linkages, sister partnership things, the media. But the key that unlocks all of it for the Chinese is getting the judiciary. Once you have no escape, once you've got the police and the police can arrest you and you have no recourse in the judiciary, you're captured. Not just elite capture, but state capture. So in the case of Daniel Soudani, he was just recently arrested on charges that make no sense. He wasn't given the charges initially, and the police bailed him out immediately. And I think what they're doing is they're testing to see whether there's going to be an international response. And so far, there's been nothing from the Australians on the record that the Australian High Commissioner won't even meet with Daniel Soudani. And if the prosecution goes ahead, then it's going to signal to everybody else across the Pacific, why stand up against the Chinese? You taking the Chinese money? You'll be able to buy your beach house on the Gold Coast. You'll be able to send your kids to university. You'll get good health care. You don't take the Chinese money, you're going to end up in jail. You won't be able to pay for your wife's medical care. Your kids will be harassed at school. So in one individual, you're seeing the Chinese testing out, I would argue, their case about how to use political warfare to capture an entire state. And I would personally like to see democracies come together to show how the Solomon Islands can be a case study in how to liberate a country from Chinese political warfare.
Thank you. Andrew, back to you. In the spirit of Congresswoman Radewagen's call for thinking about the future, your report includes 30 policy recommendations, including recommendations on how the U.S. government should be structured, on economic development, security cooperation, people-to-people ties. Prioritize for us, what are the top 3 to 5 of the 30 recommendations that you hope the Trump administration will focus on in the years ahead?
Sure. Of that 30, I would group it like this. The first thing that comes to mind is presence. I think it's important that the United States is present in the region and makes those investments, that we show up and that we stay there. Whether that's looking at embassies, whether that's making sure services are available, that and having strong qualified diplomats in those postings as well, I think is a very good thing we do presence-wise. But it also, something that comes to mind is, I think it would be great to have a sitting president visit the Pacific Islands. It's not been done before. And if I understand correctly, as Cleo spoke about the COFA states, the U.S. is obligated to defend them and treat them like U.S.
Family.
It's family. It's a good word, family. Should there be a time of crisis? If I recall correctly, those are the only 3 countries that a sitting U.S. president has not visited in which the U.S. is obligated to defend. I think that should change. I've called for that for a couple of years at this point, and I think there's an historic opportunity to make that happen in the coming years that no president's ever done before. That also includes other high-level visits, whether it's secretaries of state, defense, treasury, on the econ side of things, commerce, to see what types of partnerships can be developed on the economic front and on the development front as well. The second thing that comes to mind when prioritizing is, how do we build trust? Given that the United States is re-engaging and that there is a lot of work that's needed to show that the U.S. ought to be considered a partner of choice in working with its allies and partners, I think it's important to emphasize people-to-people ties, to show that as we have this presence involved, that as we work with our friends, to show that the United States can have great elements of, say, sports diplomacy. I'm a big football fan. I love anything Texas, I love it. So I would love to see my Houston Texans, as an example, go down, start throwing footballs around to our friends in the Pacific. That'd be pretty cool. But I also think there's a value to that, about showing how, from a people angle, that there are things we can bond over, to show that we're all able to build that trust, to build those ties, and with the Pacific, knowing how important relationships are. And that is a very powerful means as engagement, as it serves to larger ends. So I think that's an element of building that trust and laying the foundation for many of the more specific recommendations in this paper. And the third thing that then comes to mind is delivering on our commitments. I think it's great to talk, but I want to make sure we walk that walk too. And making sure that as we think about whether it's economic initiatives, public-private partnerships, looking at environmental resiliency, looking at climate concerns that the region has, understanding how we can work on educational fronts, public diplomacy, journalism, security cooperation, counter illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and so on. Those are the types of issues that I think we can cooperate very closely with our Pacific friends and deliver tangible results. And as we get that track record of showing how we can work together, we support our countries, our peoples, that I think allows for our opportunities to think bolder, to think bigger, and then think down the road knowing that America is present, that America is trustworthy, and that America delivers. Those two things combined with all the specific recommendations in that report, I think are what I would prioritize going forward.
Okay, Greg, last question to you before we turn to the audience for a little Q&A. Are there any major action items that you would like to see from the U.S. and its allies in 2025?
Actually, Andrew just mentioned one of those for me. For me, going back to President Biden's planned trip to Papua New Guinea, which fell through because of domestic politics here in the U.S., didn't happen. I think that was a bold endeavor. Would have liked to have seen that happen. But I agree, I think, with the rest of the panel that what I would really like to see is a visit to one of the FAS states. As Clea was mentioned, these are our most special relationships in the region, perhaps our most special relationships in the world in terms of what they have offered to us and what we have offered to them. That needs to be, I know they're small, I know that they're not significant in the minds of most Americans, but that's the other thing that needs to change. If we think about U.S. policy shifting to this region, the things that need to happen right away, if we are concerned about China, if we are concerned about these peoples in the region because we have a long history and legacy with them, if because our own prosperity is dependent upon that access across the Pacific Ocean, at least for another generation, the things we need to do here at home are, one, make sure that our policymakers at the highest level understand the importance of this particular region. They just don't. I mean, we talked about learning things in high school. I learned a few things in high school about Guadalcanal, and then I had to find out where it is, right? That's probably the same with high schoolers today. Those of us of a certain age might understand this, but most Americans do not understand how much American blood and treasure is invested in these people and in this region. Our policymakers need to stay focused. Obviously, the U.S. has responsibilities around the world. Those are important as well. But for people interested in the Indo-Pacific, you cannot just fly over the Pacific to get to the rest of the region. You have to go through it. If something were to happen that is truly disastrous and a crisis, we will have to go through it, which means you have to have those relationships built. You have to have them built before the crisis happens. So having the policymakers understand the necessity to do so now and to reach out and to learn at the highest level and to stay focused on the region is the first thing. Second thing is institutions. I think, as we've already mentioned, be present on the ground. The State Department needs to flesh out all of the embassies, build out new consulates, not just the State Department. If we're talking about the FAS, we're talking about a series of different departments here involved. Interior needs to flesh this out, DOJ, FAA, and so on and so on. It's not about flooding the region with more people to come in and pressure the region, but to treat them as real peers, ask them what they need, and help them build their own capacity so that we can reach our mutual interests with them. The third thing, which is the broader thing, which is I think we start now. It's not just for 2025, it's for the whole entire generation to build out the importance of the Pacific as Americans. As we already heard from the Congresswoman, yes, New Zealand is a Pacific state. Guess what else is a Pacific island state? The United States of America, right? These are American people. This is the American homeland. I think, as Cleo has mentioned, in my mind, you start with our own people, you start with our own territories, you build out to our special partners in the FAS, and on from there. You can't do everything. I don't expect the budgets are going to shift so that we can do everything all at once in all places. So we start where it's most important to us and where the people understand us and we understand them. That has to happen now.
Thanks, Greg. Do we have any audience questions? We do. I think she's going to bring you a mic.
Thank you. I'm Jay Kansara, a board member of a group called the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs, and they are becoming more active in foreign policy. And so this is very important. How do we assess India's role in this region as a partner for many of the things we discussed? Because India is the largest military power in the Quad in Asia. How do we assess using it and leveraging it, and what are actually the downsides to that?
Question.
So this is thank you. Been working on this for a long time. So from my perspective, two things need to happen at the same time. You need to block the malign influence, and you need to build alternatives. Right? So China usually comes in with a commercial front, says we're going to help you economically, and we have really let the region down in terms of economic development. That economic development always has a strategic component, and it's greased with corruption. Right? So they'll say, we'll help you build a port. The port just happens to be perfect for certain sorts of PLA vessels, but then they're also bribing the customs people, and you don't actually know what's going in. And I would say, by the way, if there's one thing that you can do to help the entire region, is go after the corruption. You don't go after the corruption, you can't really move. So you block that malign influence, but then at the same time, you build alternatives. And what India can do, India is the Quad member that actually has an economy that's the most compatible to the economies across the region. And when Prime Minister Modi went to Papua New Guinea, I mean, they touched his feet. I mean, they were so happy to see India show up. And it's the sort of India that you saw with the leadership of the G20, right? So on the build side, not necessarily the block side, the hard security side, but on the economic building side, with health, with education, with small, medium-sized businesses, all that sort of stuff, India can be incredibly effective and helpful. It is used to working in these kinds of environments. It speaks English. It's culturally compatible across the region. And it can block that initial Chinese entry point, which is commercial, and fill it with something that actually helps the local economies to grow. So India, I think, is potentially extremely helpful, and we're starting to see a lot more interest, like the National Maritime Foundation in India started to talk about it a lot more. There's designations for people within MEA to look at Oceania. But I think that personally, I think on that build front, let us take care of the blocking to a large degree, which, because we're in a political warfare situation, prioritizes things like, like going after the corruption, which you absolutely have to do. But on the build stuff, like the health side, they're great Americans, like Dr. Eileen Natuzzi, who's sitting in the Solomon Islands, who's saying, we need healthcare here. The first country that comes in and builds up the healthcare system in these places will be, you're touching the families at a very deep level, will be loved. If it comes in as either India on its own, but ideally as part of cooperations with the US, it is going to transform the region.
Anyone else want to add?
Well, I would just add, just very quickly, you started with sort of a large military in the Indo-Pacific on the Indian side. And just to stress, I think what Cleo's offered here is, I think the answer for the Pacific Islands, of course, is not to stress the military part of that. It is all the rest of the parts of the security. Human security. So when you go to the islands, they are less concerned about the great power competition, which we might be struggling with here in this town. They're concerned about the security of finding potable water and what that means today and what that might mean 2 or 3 years down the road. They're concerned about non-communicable diseases, things that they need right now, right? They're concerned about sea level rise today, not 10 or 50 years, but today. They need some of those answers. And finding that sort of niche where the US can play a greater role and at the same time secure its own broader strategic interests is going to be where India can play a role, sort of filling those gaps, working with the other partners to find that niche where, in particular on the commercial sector, India is perfectly situated to replace or leverage out the Chinese.
I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. And if not, I will ask our panelists if you have any closing remarks.
I'm just incredibly grateful that we're talking about this. This is the buffer between Asia and the Americas, and as Congresswoman Radewagen started off by pointing out, including Latin America. So anytime you hear about China going into Latin America, they don't teleport there. They're going across the Pacific. And we know that as well for us, that it's coming right across here. But it's not China. The compacts were set up under the Soviet time. Right? There is always going to be tension between Asia and the Americas. And the question is, are the people in the center going to have the option to be free and democratic and choose their own futures? Or are they going to be, as we're seeing in the Solomons, increasingly come under the sphere of influence that puts them at the center of a geopolitical fight? The narrative war around this is incredibly important. It is being framed as US versus China instead of freedom versus autocracy. And we need to change that narrative so that the people in the region understand what's coming at them, and we are more clear about this region will never not be important. History is geography. And this geography is always going to be important, and it has to stay free. Right now, it's a political warfare battle. If we lose the political warfare battle, we end up in a World War II situation. And the people of the region should not be put through this again. The way to fight that is to win on the political warfare battlefield now with a very strong military base, rebuild the industrial base, put in the shipbuilding, all that sort of stuff. But we don't want to get there again. We are in a period like Pete Ellis described in the early 20s, where the takeover is happening. We will not be able to move if we don't do something quickly.
I just want to say thank you again to Congresswoman Radewagen for excellent speech. Look forward to learning more about that. And thank you to Jeff, Greg, and Cleo for being here and those showing up. It's, part of this paper, once again, was wanting to attempt to make a difference, attempt to propose ideas, and attempt to start conversations and to lead to tangible benefits. And I certainly hope that, as we heard from today's panel, from the speech today, and certainly with the Pacific Pivot report, is that America wants to be in the region, wants to be a strong friend. And there are ways to do that. There are certainly things we have to consider and debate about, identify the best policy solutions to be there. But as we preserve peace and prosperity for the American people, we very much wanting to do that with our allies and partners, and very much with our Pacific friends as well. So this is, I think, something that'll be ongoing, a region of importance that'll continue to be on the rise. I certainly encourage people to really keep the momentum going, to really keep building off of the successes we've seen over the past few years. And this is an opportunity to make amends from what we've seen for the past few decades, an attempt to rectify some problems and make sure that we have solutions going forward that makes a difference in American people, makes a difference for a free and open and peaceful Indo-Pacific, and something that I'm very optimistic about and excited about in the years ahead.
Again, I'll just second what I've heard here. My big concern moving forward is distraction. And the United States is easily distracted with many things to do around the world. So my appeal is, we can talk about this all day, but all of you, please help us push to remind the American people, remind American policymakers of how vital this region is for American interests. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone joining today at home and in the audience, and join me in a round of applause for Andrew and the panel.